Hello, and welcome to another topic lecture on my channel. My name is Jet Smith, and I am the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho. The purpose of this video, like all the others on my channel, is to create free and accessible help materials for people that are trying to get better at speech and debate and prepare for tournaments. So this is the January 2025 public forum debate topic, and it reads, "The African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state." This topic will likely only be used for about 3 or 4 tournaments, but that is an important topic because many places have either their state championships or their national qualifying tournaments during this time, or it's the topic right before that when people are solidifying decisions about what events they want to do, what partners they want to be with, and making sure that they're getting in front of the judges that will decide who's going to state and nationals. So in this video, we're going to talk about a couple things. First, we will analyze the resolution to break down its kind of core components. Then we will go to the pro arguments. I've come up with 10 that you could read as to why we should grant Somaliland recognition as an independent state, and then 10 arguments as to why the African Union should not do that. So now let's jump into analyzing the resolution itself. As always, we're going to look at 5 aspects of this resolution. Trichotomy, what type of topic is it? Definitions, what do the important words in the topic mean? Background, what real world life events led to this topic being created, stakeholders, who is going to be affected by the decisions that are made on this topic, and then core issues, what are the biggest things at stake here that are going to be the core areas of clash and disagreement. So first, let's talk trichotomy. That is, what type of topic is it? Again, the topic reads, "The African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state." Now, this is a policy topic because we have an actor, the African Union, the word should, and an action, which is granting diplomatic recognition. As is pretty common lately, we have another policy topic. We haven't had a harms versus benefits topic in public forum in quite a while. So now let's talk about definitions. The first definition that I think you need to know is about what the African Union actually is. Now, the African Union is an intergovernmental organization that was established in 2002 that is meant to promote unity and solidarity of the African states, to spur economic development, and to promote international cooperation. Now, there are 55 member states, and there have only been 2 additional states recognized as part of that 55 since the creation of the African Union. So there is a gigantic list of countries that you can look at. I'm not going to read every single one of them, but the topic that we are debating centers around one particular currently recognized member state and a state within that member country that wants to become its own independent nation. The member state is Somalia, and the group within that state seeking independence is Somaliland. Before we can get to that, though, what does it mean for the African Union to grant diplomatic recognition? Diplomatic recognition is the procedure by which a new state is formally accepted by other states as a member of the international community. Then the recognition of a new state involves the sovereignty of the state and its independent position in relation to other states. So that kind of tells you, simply by granting diplomatic recognition, you make something an independent state. So it's kind of repetitive to also include as an independent state at the end of the topic. But the independent state definition, if you want a separate one, could be a body of people united together for the purpose of promoting their mutual safety and advantage by their combined strength. A politically organized community enters of right into the family of states. And most importantly, as part of this definition, a set of institutions whose functions are social control and authoritarian decision-making and implementation processes, seeking autonomy from other states. So that is essentially what the African Union would be granting the Republic of Somaliland if it were to recognize it diplomatically. Now, where and who are we talking about? So Somalia is the country that is currently recognized as an independent state as part of the African Union. It is the easternmost country of Africa, right on the Horn of Africa, and it occupies a very important geopolitical position between sub-Saharan Africa and the countries of Arabia and southwestern Asia. The capital is Mogadishu as well. Somaliland is the area highlighted in yellow, although that is arguable. If it's to the leftmost side, it's definitely Somaliland, but the side that is bordering Puntland is also disputed territory. But Somaliland is a breakaway, semi-desert territory that declared independence after the overthrow of a military dictator in 1991. And even though it wasn't and isn't internationally recognized, it has its own political system, its own government, and a lot of the chaos and violence that are affecting Somalia are not really affecting Somaliland. It also has its own capital and has a population of about 5.7 million. Now, Somaliland is one of 6 states that is in Somalia, and Somalia has these different states that all have varying degrees of desire for independence, but the strongest, most we want to be our own land and area part of Somalia is Somaliland. So now let's talk about the background of the topic, or what events sparked this conversation to need to debate this in the first place. So the area that is now Somalia used to be divided into 2 main colonial territories. There was British Somaliland in the north and then Italian Somaliland in the south. But in 1960, British Somaliland gained independence and then joined Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic. So they teamed up essentially to guarantee that they would get to be their own territories and to try and get rid of colonial rule in response to global conflicts that were happening at the time. But after lots of conflict and marginalization and oppression under the central government of Somalia, Somaliland, the area that used to be territorially controlled by the British, declared its independence in 1991. So they've been saying they're an independent country for over 30 years, and Somalia has opposed this independence for over 30 years as well. Even though it essentially operates as its own country and has its own government, constitution, and currency and security forces, Somaliland is currently not recognized by any other country or international organization as an independent state, including the African Union, which means that it's very hard for Somaliland to engage in a lot of activities that are economic, military, or diplomatic in nature cooperatively with other nations because it lacks that recognition. Now, recently, Trump and other conservative politicians in the United States have been calling for Somaliland's independence. And when I say recently, I mean as I'm recording this lecture, there are articles coming out today on December 21st, 2024 about the issue. And this has really upset Somalia and China because they see it as a violation of Somalia's sovereignty. Now, Somaliland also very recently, as in within the last couple of weeks and days, has made a deal with Ethiopia, which is a landlocked state in Africa, to say, hey, you can go through our territory to access the sea in exchange for recognizing us as an independent country, which greatly upset Somalia, saying that's our territory and you are now recognizing one of our states as not one of our states. And Turkey is a country that is mediating the conflict through the next few months to the point where discussions are set to happen in January and February of 2025, which is the exact time that we are debating this. So this is a very current and evolving issue. Next, let's talk about stakeholders, which is who cares and who is affected by the outcome of this discussion and of this topic. So Somaliland's government and citizens definitely care a lot because this is, what they want, what they've been advocating for over 3 decades. And Somalia's government and citizens of the other states of Somalia also are stakeholders because whether they want it or not, the effect that independence would have on them would probably be pretty large, whether positive or negative. Now, other African Union member states like Ethiopia would also have a large desire to control the outcome of this decision because it would affect their trade, their economic policies, their military policies as well. There are also global superpowers like the United States and China that are interested in the outcome of whether or not the African Union would grant recognition to Somaliland. Right now, it seems like the African Union has no plans to, so this would come as quite the surprise and create an opportunity for other member states and non-member states like the US and China to react. So finally, what are the core issues at stake on this topic? Where are the disagreements going to be occurring in the core topic literature? This is an issue of autonomy versus sovereignty, of does the autonomy of Somaliland's people, of their desire to be their own country, outweigh the sovereignty or the right to rule your nation and your citizens of Somalia? There's also an issue of what is going to be the most stabilizing for the region. Is it getting rid of this potential area for conflict and letting Somaliland develop its own nation? Or is it going to promote greater fracturing of Somalia and the African Union entirely? And then lastly is, what do we care about more? Do we care about the potential to help or hurt Somalia? Or do we care about the potential to help or hurt Somaliland? Or do we value the helping of Somalia more than the helping of Somaliland and vice versa? So all of those are Now that we have discussed the core issues on the topic, let's get into 10 arguments that the pro can read to prove why the African Union should grant Somaliland diplomatic recognition as an independent state. So, the first major argument I think the pro could read, and these are always in alphabetical order, not in order of like strategic viability or quality of evidence or what I'd recommend or anything like that, although I do think this is a good argument. The counterterrorism point that the pro could make says that Somaliland is more capable and more interested of fighting terrorism than many surrounding areas and the country of Somalia as a whole. But because it lacks independent recognition, it can't really form the counterterrorism partnerships or have U.S. military bases inside Somaliland to try and fight terrorism. Or same thing with other countries, because it lacks independence. Everything has to go through Somalia, and Somalia is less willing or less capable in some ways of counterterrorism efforts than Somaliland is. But recognition by the African Union would grant Somaliland the international legitimacy needed to form those strong relationships, to engage in intelligence sharing and resource sharing, in addition to military aid and stations being positioned there to help fight terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab. And by enhancing counterterrorism efforts, then there will be greater regional stability and security and a reduction in the risk of terrorist attacks in the Horn of Africa region. The second pro argument that you could make is about decolonization. This could be read in a critical way or in more of a traditional way, but essentially you're arguing that Somaliland's case for independence is based on the fact that they voluntarily joined Somalia to try and end colonial rule in 1960, and they want a restoration of their independence that they had, not to secede for the first time, essentially. And by granting diplomatic recognition, we are challenging these artificial colonial boundaries that were only set up through colonization and violent processes that are constricting African citizens in Somaliland from their inherent right to self-determination. And by recognizing Somaliland's independence, you take an important step in rectifying the injustices of colonialism in that region and help provide a framework for other regions that are also seeking self-determination through international law recognition from arbitrary boundaries that have only really been imposed because of colonialism that we're trying to get away from. The third pro argument area is about democracy preservation and promotion. This says that Somaliland, unlike a lot of other places, and Somalia itself, has made a lot of progress in ensuring democratic governance through free and fair elections, through peaceful transfers of power. But a lot of these other places, including Somalia, are plagued by conflict, corruption, and instability. By recognizing Somaliland's independence, it validates the democratic will of Somaliland citizens, while also rewarding democracy initiatives with granted legitimacy, and it encourages other nations to follow Somaliland's lead. And by promoting these democratic values, you inspire democratic reforms across Africa to try and stop the spread of authoritarianism and contribute to regional stability. Fourth pro argument you could make is about economic development. This says that Somaliland wants to be able to grow and develop and diversify its economy, but it lacks access to foreign investments and loans from international organizations like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Because it doesn't have that international recognition, everything has to go through Somalia, and that kind of makes it impossible for it to get the types of loans that it needs to grow its economy. But if the African Union diplomatically recognizes Somaliland, it gives it the international legitimacy needed to engage in greater trade partnerships, attract foreign investment from other nations, and get those loans and funding revenue sources from international organizations. This will help Somaliland develop its economy, reduce poverty, create jobs, diversify its economy, and improve the standard of living for the citizens that live there. Fifth argument area for the pro is about forcing Somaliland to grow / be independent, where right now Somalia lacks stability and effective governance and economic diversification due to a lot of internal issues. If we grant diplomatic recognition via the African Union to Somaliland, Somalia has to kind of give up these cries for sovereignty and instead actually focus on fixing the issues going on in their country by improving its governance, developing its economy, trying to sort through internal conflicts. And Somalia's reaction can pose a great opportunity to improve its governance, to grow its economy, to become more stable by refocusing on getting international aid and cooperating with partners rather than just constantly trying to enforce its will on Somaliland. The sixth area that the pro could talk about is human rights. Somaliland has made a lot of improvements and has a much greater commitment than surrounding areas and than particularly Somalia does to protecting human rights, according to some. And its citizens have frequently had its human rights violated over the past several decades by Somalia's efforts to keep the country unified. But by recognizing Somaliland, it can strengthen its own governmental institutions through cooperation, through international human rights organization resources to reduce the risk of human rights being violated and those going unaddressed. And by granting diplomatic recognition to the human right to secede and the human right to self-determination is respected, but also Somaliland is more likely to be held accountable for its mistakes in human rights on an international stage if its independence is formally recognized. And it can join things like the United Nations or be recognized by other diplomatic organizations. Seventh argument area is international cooperation, which says that Somaliland is different than Somalia and other surrounding regions based off of its commitment to democracy and counterterrorism. And it is in a really strategically important location, which makes it valuable as a partner in international cooperation. But because it's not independent, they can't really join treaties or sign agreements or engage in strategic, economic, diplomatic, and military partnerships. But if there was diplomatic recognition, they could start doing those international efforts, which would help to address security threats and counter influence of rising authoritarian powers like China. Eighth argument area for the pro is about preventing war. Now, Somalia is having a lot of tension with Somaliland and other nations because of their desire to recognize Somaliland, which makes the region a really big risk for military conflict. But if the African Union diplomatically recognizes Somaliland's independence, it would remove the momentum, the legitimacy, and any real support internationally for potential military aggressive acts that Somalia would engage in to try and reunify. And it would take the wind out of the sails of Somalia, threatening other nations that are wanting to grant recognition as well. Like if one or two African member states tried to grant recognition to Somaliland, then Somalia would have a pretty big, easy claim and justification for engaging in military threats and reactions to that. But if the entire African Union grants this recognition, then Somalia really can't afford to go against the entire African Union. And this would definitely prevent a war over Somaliland's independence, which could be coming in the future, helping to save lives, avoid displacement of populations, and it would avoid a humanitarian potential crisis while making the region more stable as a whole. Next argument area is kind of a turn to the most common, I think, con argument, which is that we should inspire further independence movements because Somaliland is just one of many places in Africa and across the world that are trying to have their own country based off of self-determination, trying to decolonize, and trying to have their freedom from oppressive forces. And by granting diplomatic recognition to Somaliland's independence movements, that would give legitimacy to other independence movements in places like Taiwan, Palestine, Sudan, Ukraine, all sorts of those things. And this is good because when we give independence movements international recognition and credibility, it can do it legally through diplomatic processes rather than through military processes, which is good because it preserves people's rights to self-determination and promoting citizens' own interests. The 10th and final argument area for the pro is about spurring American follow-on. There's cards out there that says that if the African Union grants recognition to Somaliland, that the United States would likely follow through and do so as well. So any argument you can come up with about why it would be good for America to diplomatically grant recognition to Somaliland's independence, you can make here. So it would probably help us curb China's influence in the region, secure America's interests, increase economic development, and opportunities for both areas. So now that we have heard some arguments as to why it is a good idea to grant diplomatic recognition to Somaliland as an independent state, what are the cons or the reasons maybe the African Union should think twice and not do this? The first of which is angering China. So Somaliland has a lot of strong ties to Taiwan because they both have similar claims to independence and justifications for those claims. So China is committed to telling Somalia, no, they're part of your country, you are a sovereign nation, because it kind of grants the same level of legitimacy to their own claims. But if the African Union grants this diplomatic recognition to Somaliland, it will definitely upset China and be interpreted as also granting legitimacy to similar claims being made by Taiwan, and that might force economic and even military reactions that are negative from China. So the African Union, this is bad because they depend on China as a major economic partner for development projects. So China could pull back on those, could try to spark, regional conflicts and disputes, and it could lead to a lack of development economically and undermine the stability of the African continent and the African Union as a whole. Next up is destroying Somalia. Again, I think this is a core argument issue for the Khan to just say that Somalia is really struggling at the moment to try and recover and survive a civil war and a fight against Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization. And its central government might be weak, but it's getting better. But many of its 6 states are on the verge of revolt or trying to seek independence. So if the African Union recognizes Somaliland, it could plunge the entire country into chaos, destroy its federal government, hurt its economy by losing access to the resources and taxes from Somaliland. And this would embolden Puntland, Jubaland, and Hernaland, who are different states within Somaliland, to try and follow, or within Somalia, to try and follow Somaliland's lead, essentially fracturing Somalia into 6 different countries, essentially a balkanization of that country. And this would decimate Somalia, cause tons of conflict from the resulting power vacuum, probably create a humanitarian crisis, and worsen security issues and economic issues in the area. Third con argument is about conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, which might not be the countries in the resolution, but the 2 countries are having very high tensions over Ethiopia's desire and projects to build a dam and its effect on Egypt's access to the Nile River. And Ethiopia wants to recognize Somaliland's independence because it would give them essentially an opportunity to expand and get strategic developments in the region. And Egypt would view this as a move to encircle, surround, and undermine Egyptian influence. So that could cause Egypt to attack Ethiopia to try and prevent anything that could undermine its position in the region. And an armed conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia would plunge the entire region into widespread instability and conflict and displacement, probably causing a massive loss of life and humanitarian crisis, and opening the door for a power vacuum and terrorist organizations to try and exploit the conflict. So the fourth con argument is about enabling corruption, which says that right now, Somaliland, part of the biggest reasons why it's making progress democratically is because all of its funding comes from its own citizens through taxation mechanisms. And that means it's accountable to the people that it's taxing because that's where it gets its money. But recognition by the African Union granting Somaliland independence would mean that they can start taking out loans and getting foreign assistance from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, from other countries that would start making them accountable to those organizations that they're getting money from instead of their own citizens. And a lot of the times that aid, those partnerships come with restrictions that require austerity measures or policies that don't really help the poor as much, and put restrictions on what they can spend the money on and what policies they can implement, which means that Somaliland becomes less accountable to its own citizens, and it reverses all of this democratic progress while opening the door to selfish corruption measures that benefit the government of Somaliland and the international monetary organizations more than it does the citizens, which would undermine living conditions and trust in the government. Fifth con argument area would be that it's just a bad time, that because Ethiopia and Somalia, as discussed in the background section of this video, are in the middle of negotiations by Turkey to try and figure out how we can have sea access through Somaliland without granting Somaliland independence, or at least in the view of Ethiopia. And the plan is to expand on those talks, and they've just brokered a deal essentially recently, but they're supposed to continue to talk about this in January and February of 2025. So if the African Union suddenly out of nowhere grants diplomatic recognition prior to or right after a deal being made through these negotiations, it would decimate the relationship between Ethiopia and Somalia and could produce a military conflict or economic sanctions or problems between Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, and other member states, causing conflict, loss of life, and economic progress. Next, we have predatory lending, which is similar to the corruption argument, but it is a different kind of impact story. That is again, because they lack independence, they can't really get streams of revenue from the International Monetary Fund or from the World Bank or from other countries. But if we grant recognition of them via the African Union, then they can start taking out these loans. But these loans and these funds are terrible because they have incredibly high interest rates. They require you to pass really bad economic policies. They put your country in debt. And it can expose predatory lending to Somaliland, which means that they'll constantly be dependent on these loans, that their economy will be less stable, and in the long term, their growth will suffer by trying to get access to these funds to have short-term projects. The next argument is about rewarding bad behavior. There's probably a better way to phrase this argument that I couldn't come up with, but you're essentially arguing that Somaliland, while making some progress, has actually been backsliding recently on human rights and democracy through facing numerous challenges, which means that it's not a good time to recognize their independence now when they are becoming less democratic and less good on the human rights front. But the African Union's diplomatic recognition of Somaliland, of their independence, would send a message that you don't need to improve your human rights, you don't need to improve your governance structures, we'll give you international legitimacy anyways, which weakens the African Union's credibility as a promoter of democracy, as a promoter of human rights, and would embolden Somalia and Somaliland to continue to crack down on protesters, to postpone presidential elections, to do things that they really shouldn't be doing because they were just granted independence despite doing these bad things. The eighth con argument is about sparking further secessions, and I think that this is the biggest piece of con ground, and that is that there are a lot of independence movements in several member states across the African continent that are trying to gain independence, but the African Union is respecting current borders because it wants to avoid chaos and conflict. But when you diplomatically recognize Somaliland, you are violating all precedents and all of the reasons you're giving to these other independence movements as to why they're not going to be recognized, because it is a post-colonial state seeking independence from another post-colonial state. And that emboldens separatist movements across Africa to try and do the same thing. But if the African Union does respond by granting all of them independence, then it's going to cause so much fracturing that it's going to plunge the region into chaos. And if they fail to grant recognition to these other independence movements, then they might try to get their independence militarily through violent means, which would cause instability. It would lose life. There would be economic progress that is halted, and it would undermine cooperation between all of the different member states of the African Union. Ninth argument for the con is about territorial disputes, which says that the area known as Somaliland isn't even necessarily defined because Puntland, which is right nearby, are both kind of semi-autonomous, although Somaliland's more autonomous states of Somalia, and they disagree over what territory counts as Somaliland and what territory counts as Puntland, which means that it's kind of impossible to have a clear border. So if the African Union recognizes Somaliland, what are they even recognizing? Where are they going to draw the line of this territory? Likely it legitimizes their claim to territory that Puntland claims, which would embolden militarization of Somaliland to try and defend this disputed area or to take over this disputed area, and Puntland would do the same, which makes violence between the two states of Somalia more likely. And these clashes could destabilize the entire region. It could bring in international actors, like China could defend one side, the United States could defend one side, creating a proxy war, and it would widen the conflict, displacing the population, increasing the number of refugees, and weakening the fight against terrorism because now they're too focused on fighting just another kind of innocent state. The 10th and final argument is an alternative, a generalized alternative that the con could defend. And I think it's vague enough that you really shouldn't get accused of it being a counterplan because logically, the African Union is the decision maker. So what could the African Union do instead of granting formal diplomatic recognition of Somaliland as an independent state? Well, they could encourage or require Somalia and Somaliland's leaders to engage in mediation over what should be done to respect autonomy and sovereignty and increase cooperation. Now, mediation probably solves because it avoids potential incoming conflicts, produces compromise over the different argument areas that are happening, and it would probably be better than a sudden and unexpected immediate recognition of independence. But it's especially a good alternative because it can't happen at the same time. The African Union can't say, yep, Somaliland is definitely, as of right now, an independent state, and also say, well, let's talk about it and mediate and try to come up with a solution that everybody's a fan of, because that process would take months. So those are 10 arguments as to why maybe the African Union should not diplomatically recognize Somaliland as an independent state. So, final thoughts on this topic. What do you need to keep in mind to be successful in debating it? One, this is an international topic. The judge might not know a lot, but the actor in the resolution is the African Union. So, the judge is not going to be representing the US federal government, but the African Union. So, don't just make all of your arguments about why the US should grant it or why it's good or bad for the US for this to happen. You also need to keep staying up on the news. Public forum is supposed to be about current events, and this topic really is. There's so much ongoing stuff happening even as I record this lecture right now. So stay up to date on the news in case arguments that I'm giving here get thumped so that you can change your strategy. Lastly, you need to focus on turns and offense, reasons why the opposite of what your opponent's saying is going to happen, reasons why if they say recognition is good for something, you can say it's bad for that thing, or vice versa, because most of the arguments on this topic are pretty similar. It was really hard to come up with 10 separate arguments for the pro and for the con. And a lot of the times, your debates are going to come down to the direction of the link. Does granting recognition make this issue better, or does it make it worse? So focus your evidence, your research, and your thought process on that. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it was educational for you. I'm planning on doing topic lecture videos for the rest of the season for at least the February public forum topic, the March public forum topic, and the March-April Lincoln Douglas debate topic. I'm also going to put out some videos about world schools over the winter break, so stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.